On January the 16th, 1979, with the streets ablaze and his rule in tatters, the Shah fled the country never to return. At a stroke, 2,500 years of Persian monarchy came to an end.
خروج شاه اولین مرحله پیروزی ملت ماست و ما مشکلات زیاد در پیش داریم.
The stage was set for the return of Grand Ayatollah Khomeini after 16 years in exile. 2 weeks after the Shah's departure, Khomeini and his entourage prepared to leave Paris, bound for Tehran.
We were a little nervous that they might hijack the plane and take us to an unknown place and then arrest us, because the Shah's secret police, SAVAK, was still in charge and active. But we were mostly thinking about the fact that we were going to be in Iran in the next few hours and what the people's response would be like to our presence there.
But they needn't have worried. For Khomeini's supporters, waiting for him in Iran was a day they had long dreamed of, but thought they would never see.
I was one of the first people to go aboard the airplane when they landed. The Imam was sitting alone. There was no fear on his face. I had struggled from 1961 to 1979. It was a duration of 18 years of struggle. I even went to jail. I felt I was flying. I was so happy to see the struggle had come into fruition.
Journalists asked the Ayatollah what he felt returning to Iran, and he is reported to have replied, nothing. But the same could not be said of the many thousands who had protested against the Shah's regime. Suddenly, the possibilities seemed endless.
The great thing about revolution, it was not only happening in the streets, it was also happening in people's minds. Let's say from December 78 to December 79, where the Shah's regime had fallen, I mean, there was absolute freedom. Books were being translated and sold by the kilos. People suddenly had access to Marx, they had access to all these writers they couldn't read before, because of the censorship.
Khomeini quickly appointed Mehdi Bazargan, a pro-democracy activist, as interim prime minister, briefly raising hopes that the new government would reflect the wide range of voices who had united against the Shah. But for the old guard, who were perceived to be enemies of the revolution, retribution was swift and brutal. Many were imprisoned and killed, while others were forced into exile.
Around 5:30 in the afternoon, they entered into the campus, and we came out. Somebody arrested me there with a machine gun on my chest. Said, "Don't move." I told myself, this is the end of my life. I have one chance to save my skin. At one moment that he was trying to get another one, I fled. But I didn't dare to go out because I was shooting from every side. So somebody pushed me and said, "Mr. Majdi, this is the moment to go out." So I went out on the sidewalk of the street. A revolutionary group was attacking with machine guns and everything. They were shooting from inside, so they didn't pay attention to me.
Within weeks of his return, Khomeini appointed Ayatollah Khalkhali to establish a new revolutionary court to deliver Islamic rulings. Khalkhali would become known as the hanging judge. Under his direction, hundreds of former government officials and SAVAK agents were executed.
We had, in the first weeks and continuing into the first months of the revolution, drumhead trials which lasted a few minutes, often held in the middle of the night, in which ministers, military officers, members of the security services of the old regime were tried, sentenced to death and executed. And we Every morning we woke up to see in the newspapers these gory pictures of bodies, you know, with bullet holes in them, who had been assassinated the previous night.
As scores were settled with many of the Shah's extended circle, some felt that the revolution was losing its way.
The day I sort of changed perspective on the revolution was this day, this very instant when I took this photograph. These were the first 4 generals, one of them Nasiri, the head of the Savak, Rahimi, in charge of the of Tehran, Khosrodad and Najid. They had been executed the night before, and they were executed after a secret trial. We, by we mean the nationalist element within the revolution, we wanted open trials. Because first of all, they had, we wanted them to have a chance to defend themselves.
But many of the newly empowered clergy felt that these trials were fully justified.
It wasn't just Khalkhali. He was involved in the committees to fight drugs. It was the revolutionary courts and the revolutionary council who wrote up the laws and followed them. So those people who had killed and tortured people, youngsters, and murdered on the streets, should we keep them and give them breakfast and lunch? And then what would they do?
Grand Ayatollah Montazeri was once destined to be Ayatollah Khomeini's successor as supreme leader until the two fell out. He claims that many of the court's rulings were arbitrary.
Anyway, most of them were baseless. No proper trials. They were like puppet courts. I protested, and I wrote an official letter to the imam. They'd shut the doors of the prison, and they were just executing people.
With the Shah's former supporters out of the way, and the military having declared itself neutral, the Islamic Republic of Iran was formally founded on April 1st, 1979. All the perceived symbols of Western decadence were destroyed. The reign of the Shah was over forever. But his ability to provoke opposition remained undimmed. After leaving Iran, he had sought refuge in several countries, and in October 1979, he arrived in the US for cancer treatment. The visit provoked uproar at home and set in motion a chain of events that continue to reverberate 3 decades later.
On that morning, it started to rain. I clearly remember that. And I looked out my window, and there are these young, I wouldn't say kids, but college age, 17, 18-year-olds mostly, with posters of Khomeini, and some of them with clubs in their hands, climbing over the gate in droves. And the first thing that I realized is that they started to head toward my office, which is only maybe 50 yards away.
Our first aim was to bring the Shah back from America. But of course we knew it was unlikely to happen. But all protests are like that. We thought it would last 3 to 5 days.
But instead, a hostage crisis unfolded that was to endure for 444 days. By the time it was over, US President Jimmy Carter had been voted out of office. The Islamic Republic of Iran had been firmly established, and the two nations, previously so close, would become the staunchest of enemies.